So maybe you're new to sim racing, maybe you're just not sure what to drive, or maybe you're sick of that twitchy Porsche 911 GT3 and you're not quite sure what else to drive. In today's Sim Racing Tip Fridays, we're going to be talking about cars that might suit your driving style better and cars that you might enjoy racing more. In sim racing, there's so many different cars that you can choose from, all kinds of categories ranging from karting and some sims to GT racing, to formula racing, even prototype cars, touring cars, and even more. And when you're starting off with sim racing, it's exciting. There's so many things to choose from, but you don't really know where to start. Maybe you're already into a specific category of car like GT3, but you're not sure which GT3 to pick. And to be honest, we could be talking about this topic for a very, very long time. But for now, we're just going to go through a couple things. And I think because GT3 racing has become such a popular thing over the last few years, such a popular category, everybody races GT3s. I'd be very surprised if you haven't driven a GT3 car in a racing game before. Firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about engine placement in cars, because where the engine is positioned in a car heavily impacts on how the car actually handles. And this is very relevant in GT3 racing because you have so many different options, with rear-ended Porsches to front-engine Mercedes, or even mid-engine Audi or Ferraris. And this is also important to keep in mind outside of GT3 racing, because we have manufacturer cup classes such as Porsche Cup, which have rear-engine cars. They're a little bit more tricky to drive because when you're going through turns, you have the weight of the engine in the rear of the car wanting to pull you around each time you go through the turns, wanting to step out on you. We have the Lamborghini Super Trofeo class. Being a mid-engine car, it's also very nimble, but it'll also catch you out because the engine is sitting behind you. A similar situation to the Porsche, with the weight of the car behind you, it can easily get loose if you're not too careful. And then we have something like the BMW CS class here with the engine at the front. It's a whole lot more stable because we have the weight of the engine at the front of the car, so the car's pushing at the front. It's a lot more sluggish to turn in, but there's a lot more stability with it. But with front engine cars, there's not as much weight as the back, so it's easier to spin the rear tires and the car gets loose on the rear end when you're under acceleration. So when it comes to something like GT3 racing, if you struggle to keep cars on the track, if you just want a stable experience, I wouldn't recommend something like a Porsche or anything with the engine that's behind you. I would highly suggest to keep to something more front engine like an Aston Martin, Mercedes, something like that, even the Nissan GTR. They're a lot more stable, particularly on corner entry, but they're a little bit more punchy coming out the turns and are very likely to get loose on throttle. It's not to say that mid-engine cars or rear-engine cars don't do this, but it's very common in front-engine cars. But if you find front-engine cars to be a little bit too sluggish and too boring for you, well then you might want to try something that's mid-engine, like a Ferrari, or maybe even a McLaren. And in ACC, which we're on right now, these two are fairly stable options for mid-engine cars. But also in a lot of sims, the Ferrari is known for being very snappy and difficult to drive. So depending on what sim you're on, you might just have to give them all a go and see which ones feel more comfortable to you. These mid-engine cars tend to be a bit more nimble, and they also provide a more exciting driving experience. But also keep in mind that when you're in the heat of battle, these little factors like the mid-engine and the car being a little bit more loose on the rear might come into play, and you might lose the rear end in that very important moment when you're trying to get past or defend your position. Maybe you can handle a more tricky car like a Lamborghini, but can you keep your composure when you're in the heat of battle? If not, then maybe again it might be better for you to stick to something like a front engine car. Because there are occasions where people, or even myself, get into battles and sometimes it's easy just to forget the basics of driving skills, and you make one simple mistake like dropping the throttle too early and then the rear end just lets go. And doing something like that on a car like this could quite easily end your race. Whereas a front engine car will generally stabilize itself quite nicely. And front engine cars are also usually easier to catch when they get sideways. When you start getting sideways in rear engine cars, then the rear just wants to start swinging around. It's a difficult car to catch. Just some extra comfort with front engine cars, they usually can handle curbs a whole lot better. It's a lot more sketchy when you're taking big bumps and curbs with mid-engine or rear engine cars. With Porsches, I generally only recommend it if you're really confident in your driving skills, because these are quite difficult cars to drive, especially to race them hard as well. But they're also very rewarding and fun to drive. So if you're an advanced driver with good confidence in your skills, then I'd definitely recommend to go for a Porsche, because you're going to have a hell of a good time, and it's going to feel satisfying when you get wins with such a difficult car to drive. And that's just GT3, that's just one category. It's a very, very popular category, and for good reason too. The battles are usually generally very close, the cars aren't too crazy difficult to drive, and they're not too fast and they're also not too slow. But GT3s do require a very precise driving style, and hitting too many bumps and curbs can end up in spins quite easily. Sometimes we just need to take a step back, a step lower, and jump into something like a GT4 car, which is like a toned down GT3. And these cars are a little bit floatier, but they handle curbs a little bit better, and they're just a little bit more forgiving overall. And generally when you're driving slower cars, you tend to have better battles. So closer racing is quite a feature with the slower cars like GT4s. But with GT3 and GT4, we have two categories where balance of performance is a big thing, and more often than not, the balance of performance is never totally accurate. And at some tracks you end up having one car that's way quicker than another one, and then when you lose the race you get frustrated because the other car was faster than yours. So some people might prefer driving in cup classes with a single car, like the cars I mentioned before, or even the Ferrari Challenge. With these kind of cars, you know that everybody around you has the same horsepower as you, and for the most part it's about driving ability, and whoever can make the most of that one car will put it on top. And I know most motorsport fans, when jumping into sim racing, one of the first things everybody wants to do is drive an F1 car. And your two most accessible options for F1 racing would probably be the F1 games, or the original Assetto Corsa with the F1 DLCs, or the F1 mods. There's some really high quality F1 mods these days. But not often do you find people racing them online, so that's more of an offline experience. So racing online, you got the F1 games, and you also have the Mercedes W12 on iRacing. But these cars are so intense and they require super quick reaction times. You have to be constantly onto it. Your brain has to be very quick. It's honestly not the most relaxing driving experience. Your brain is always so busy when driving these things. So if you're looking for a little bit more of a laid-back driving experience, don't go for F1 cars because you're not going to find any sort of relaxing experience with these. But if you're up for that sort of challenge, iRacing is the best place for it. They do the F1 cars so well. And if open wheelers are your thing, honestly the best place I can recommend for you to go is iRacing. But the thing is, I know not everybody can afford iRacing, but if you can, then it's going to be a great place for your online open wheeler racing. And starting off with something basic like a Formula V is a good place for you to begin developing your open wheel skills. But the car is very snappy and it doesn't have any downforce, so it's a different kind of experience. But if you want a good balance with something that's not too quick, but something that does have a bit of downforce, I'd highly recommend the Formula 4 car from iRacing. I've had a ton of fun with this car so far. It's not overpowered, but it has a bit of tolerance to getting sideways, so it doesn't snap on you too quickly. And since the downforce levels aren't too high, you can still have some great races with them. So in terms of online racing with open wheelers, this is probably the car that I would personally go for the most. And in sim racing, if you often find yourself having a hard time to control rear wheel drive cars where you get on the throttle and the car's spinning all the time, well then maybe the type of car for you is a front wheel drive. You might enjoy touring car racing a little bit more than something like GT3s or GT4s. And again, for online racing, the best place to find some touring car racing will be on iRacing. And a nice place to sort of get your handle with front wheel drive cars on iRacing would be the SimLab series with this Jetta. Not too many people race it, which means you can kind of hang out the back and just get used to the car on your own and maybe tag along with a couple other drivers and get used to the basics of front wheel drive behavior. And one of the cool things with front wheel drive is that if you start to spin out or you get sideways, you can just hammer the throttle and point the steering wheel where you want to go and the car will begin to pull back in that direction. And once you get used to that, you can step into something like the TCR cars, which obviously are a wee bit more powerful, but they're also a lot more popular and you'll have plenty of close racing with these things. So generally these things are a wee bit easier to drive, not in all cases because they can get a little bit loose under braking, so it's just a new skill for you to learn. Or maybe you have really good throttle control, really good brake control, and you want to do some endurance racing, then you might have lots of fun with the LMP2 cars on iRacing. These cars do take a lot of work, they're quite difficult to drive, so if you struggle driving a GT3 car, I'd probably stay away from this one for now. And that's just a few classes. There's so many different categories in the world of motorsport, and I can't cover them all in this video. This is supposed to be just a Sim Tip Friday video, which aren't meant to be that long. But this one's been a little bit longer than usual. And these cars that I pointed out, they don't all have to be in iRacing. You could find leagues in something like Assetto Corsa or any other sim. Or maybe you don't like racing online, you just want to race offline. Maybe you can take some of these tips into your offline racing as well. And if any of you have your own kind of personal suggestions for cars to drive, for people to try, then feel free to let us know in the comments. But yeah, thank you for watching. Hopefully some of you have learned a little bit from this video, and I'll catch you in another video very soon.